Alrighty, this is a lesson on aeromedical factors for private pilots. Let me go through what we're going to talk about here. We're going to be talking about regulations of medical certification, medical certificates, requirement and duration, hypoxia, hyperventilation, ear and sinus issues, spatial disorientation, vision, carbon monoxide, and we're also going to talk about the I'm Safe checklist at the very end. So those will be the things that we're talking about here. Let me add that one actually. I just added it a few seconds ago. There we go. We're also going to talk about scuba diving a little bit and some other things as well. There we go. Sorry about the delay there. Cool. Awesome. So let's start with the review of medical certificates. We may have talked about this in another lesson, so this is probably a review for most of you guys. There's three main types. There's first class, second class, and third class. First class is for airline pilots, second class is for all other commercial pilots, and then third class is for private pilots and flight instructors. You can also take any check ride with a third class medical. Now they do have durations. First class medicals, if you're above 40, they're only good for 6 months. And if you're under 40, it's good for 12 months. Now, to be clear on that, what that means is that you are exercising the privileges of that medical certificate. So, for example, a first class can drop to a third class or second class can drop to a third class. So you can use it as a private pilot for longer than 12 months or 6 months, depending on your age. But you can't exercise it as a first class medical. For example, if you're flying for a Part 121 operator with the airlines, they require you to have a first class medical certificate. So it's only good for 6 months for that operation. But you could still go fly your airplane that you own on the weekends or whatever as a private pilot without outside of that 6 months, probably, depending on when it was issued. Second class is only good for 12 months, and then it drops to a third class for another 12 months. Sorry. 40, if you're greater than 40 years old, 24 months for the third class, and under 40, 60th month for the third class privileges. There's basic med privileges. You're limited to day and night VFR operations, and you can do some IFR flying. A maximum number of passengers is 5. The aircraft can only have 6 seats, not be certified for more than 6,000 pounds, and you're restricted to below 18,000 feet, 18,000 or below. So basically, you can't go into Class A airspace. You can't fly large airplanes, but there's lots of airplanes that are 6 seats with 6,000 pounds out there. So there are some restrictions there, and you do have that speed restriction of 250 knots. How to get it? So if you've ever had a FAA medical certificate after July 14th, 2006, it can be a special issuance one. It can be expired. It cannot have been suspended, revoked, withdrawn, or denied. And you had a education course in the preceding 24 months. You have to go through the FAA website to learn more about that. And you have a physical of some kind. It doesn't have to be from an AME, that one in the previous 48 months. Then you can fly under basic med. You can do a lot of private pilot stuff. Offenses involving alcohol and drugs. So these are some laws that we have to follow. Number one, any conviction related to the process, manufacture, transportation, or distribution or sale of narcotics can lead to suspension or revocation of any pilot certificate. Also, if you're operating as a crew member, then and that could be like a flight attendant, flight engineer, first officer, captain, just single pilot or whatever. Then that can be a 1-year denial period for any Part 61 certification. Of course, they can come and yank your current licenses as well. So here's the actual law, 9117. No person may act or attempt to act as a crew member of a civil aircraft within 8 hours after the consumption of any alcoholic beverage, number one. Doesn't matter how it impacts you or how it affects you. If you consume alcohol, you cannot be a crew member, including being a pilot, within 8 hours of that. You can't be under the influence of alcohol. And I've read some articles that suggest that having like a hangover from alcohol is considered to be under the effects of alcohol. So any lingering effects from using alcohol. while using any drug that affects a person's faculties. So this could be over-the-counter medications like Benadryl, things like that cause drowsiness. Basically, it says if you should not operate machinery on the label or may cause drowsiness, it's probably a bad choice to go flying. I would consult with an AME, an Aviation Medical Examiner, for more information on that. Or you cannot have an alcohol concentration level of 0.04 or greater in blood or breath. Now, even in an emergency, no pilot can allow a person who appears to be intoxicated to go up with them. Okay? So, unless they're a medical patient under proper care, you can't take someone up who appears to be under the influence of alcohol or drugs. This is how they can deny boarding to people on airlines. Now, if you're operating, we already talked about this, under the influence of alcohol and drugs, you can have that denial period for your Part 61 license. This is one that I really want to point out. This is a DUI or DWI for a motor vehicle. So this could be a car or motorcycle or whatever, and you get a DUI from like the state of Utah or whatever state you're in. If you're convicted of that, you must send a written report to the FAA Security and Hazmat or Hazardous Materials Safety Office within 60 days of the conviction. So make sure you report that to them. Obviously, they can come after and revoke your license if you don't comply with that notification. Now, supplemental oxygen is something you might want to use. I've used it. It can be oxygen in a can. It's got to be in an FAA-approved can or canister, I should say. And you can use different kinds of masks and things like that. But it's basically a means of providing the body with additional oxygen beyond what's available in the ambient air. And it's used to counteract the effects of reduced partial pressure of oxygen as we climb to higher altitudes. So down here on the surface, we have a certain percentage of the atmosphere that's actually oxygen. I think it's around 21% or something. And as you go up, there's not enough pressure to push that into, through the cell walls of your lungs. And so therefore we don't have enough oxygen circulating in our body is what's really happening there. So we can use supplemental oxygen to kind of overcome those effects and prevent things like hypoxia. And we're going to talk more about hypoxia later on. Typically stored in cylinders and delivered through various delivery systems, like oxygen masks. That's kind of what a canister might look like. That's a rebreather type mask there. That's a full-on quick dawn mask with, I think those are fire goggles or something on there. That's like a cannula or cannula. I actually don't know how to say it. It's C-A-N-U-L-A. It's kind of this small one that goes up into your nostrils a little bit. I've flown with that one before. They do have limits to different kinds of masks, so you definitely want to have the right mask for the altitude you're operating at. So here's the rules about when do you have to use supplemental oxygen. Now, cabin pressure, what that means is like if you're in a pressurized airplane, they probably have it pressurized to 8, 9, 10,000 feet, something like that. And so we're not talking about those planes that are pressurized. These are unpressurized aircraft, or if the pressure in the aircraft changes, like you have a rapid decompression on an airliner or something like that. So at cabin pressure altitudes between above 12,500 and up to and including 14,000 feet, each pilot must use supplemental oxygen for the portion of that flight that's greater than 30 minutes. At cabin pressure altitudes above 14,000 feet, each pilot must use supplemental oxygen during the entire flight at those altitudes. So the difference there is, one is if you're up there for greater than 30 minutes, above 12.5, then you got to put the oxygen on. If you're above 14,000 for any period of time, you have to put that oxygen on. It can be any of those masks described earlier. And then if you're above 15,000 feet, each occupant must be provided with supplemental oxygen. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to use it. They just must be provided with it. I suggest they do use it. I don't want anybody passing out and dying while I'm up there. In class, we'll watch this accident video and we'll go over some of these video reflection questions. And let's dive into some of the physiological factors. We're going to kind of blast through these. The first one's hypoxia. And hypoxia is basically when you have a deficiency of oxygen in the bloodstream tissues and cells of the body. So this includes your eyes, your brains, all those different cells that require oxygen, tissues in the body that require oxygen, they start to shut down when they don't get enough oxygen, or maybe they just don't function properly. How do you recognize hypoxia? Some of the symptoms are, let's try this again. We'll keep going here. So hypoxia can sometimes have a sense of well-being or euphoria, and that can be misleading because you're actually in peril and you just feel like everything's just kind of fine. And so you won't even maybe start to notice some of these other signs because you start to get critical symptoms like lack of clear thinking, fatigue, headache, delayed reaction time, visual impairment, and eventual unconsciousness. Now, there's different kinds of hypoxia. The first one's hypoxic hypoxia, and this occurs when you just don't receive enough oxygen overall, and that's usually just, like I said, going up in the atmosphere. That would be just there's not enough oxygen there in the air. Now, you can contrast that with anemic or hypemic hypoxia, and this when your blood just doesn't carry enough oxygen. Now, there could be plenty of air or plenty of oxygen, but maybe you're getting carbon monoxide poisoning, or maybe you don't have enough blood in your system because you gave blood at a blood bank or something like that. So the problem isn't a lack of inhaled oxygen, but with your blood itself. That's why it's anemic hypoxia. And then we have stagnant hypoxia, and this includes like when you're in shock, or maybe you've been sitting too long, or maybe you're having hypothermia, or maybe pulling too many G's. That's because your blood is stagnant. It's not flowing properly. So you got enough blood. Maybe there's even enough air, so it's not hypoxic, it's not anemic, but stagnant is because your blood is not flowing properly, and that causes hypoxia. And then you have histotoxic hypoxia, and this is when you've been consuming alcohol or drugs, and they basically block the cells, the blood's ability to deliver oxygen to the cells properly. So 4 different types there. And then how do you correct it? Well, the correct response is to get to a lower altitude or use supplemental oxygen. If you can identify what the cause of it is, like if it's anemic, or there's not much you can do about that except land. But if it's like stagnant hypoxia, get some blood flowing again. Try to stretch your legs, try to move around, things like that. Those are the corrective oxygen. You can also use supplemental oxygen. Now, hyperventilation or excessive breathing, you actually have an excessive amount of air, and it's often triggered by excitement, stress, tension, fear, and anxiety. Basically, for whatever reason, you've got a certain amount of carbon dioxide in your lungs all the time. It helps trigger your breathing. And somehow that carbon dioxide has been displaced, so your normal breathing is not being triggered properly. And so you could have any number of reasons for this to happen. But it leads to an excessive loss of carbon dioxide, and you basically have too much oxygen inside your lungs, and your breathing is going fast. It's trying to get carbon dioxide back in. You can get dizzy from it. You can get really hot and really cold. You can get sick, nausea, tingling in the extremities, right? Remedies, slow the breathing rate. Calm them down. Say, okay, breathe with me. Slow down. In, out. Slow down, slow down, slow down. Keep talking to them. Breathing into a bag works because you're breathing out some carbon dioxide, so then you're breathing it back in and trying to replace that carbon dioxide that's been displaced out of your lungs. Also, just talking out loud sometimes helps with slowing down the breathing because you have to breathe at a certain rate to be able to speak properly, so it sort of tricks you back into breathing normally. Ear and sinus issues. Those can be a problem. So basically you have these sinuses up here above your eyes and all of these tissues inside. the head here, and those can become inflamed. They can be blocked, and the problem is when they get blocked, the air can't flow in and out properly. So now you've got some air trapped in there, and as you go up, that air is expanding and it starts to push against all that stuff inside your head, and it can create a lot of pain inside your ears as well as inside your nose as well. So you have these things in your ears or these tubes inside your head called the eustachian tubes, and basically they equalize pressure between inside your skull. They allow the air to flow around in your skull there. Pressure equalization can be more difficult during descent due to partial vacuum. So you can actually be going down and your eustachian tubes are starting to crush a little bit inside your head. That can create a lot of problems as well. Then this thing called the Valsalva maneuver. This is when you pinch your nostrils, close your mouth, and blow gently. Some people don't recommend it. They say you can actually do damage, but if it's really a lot of pain, you can grab your nose, hold your breath, and blow out and feel those ears pop and equalize. You can kind of force it. I've heard it can do damage, so I would only use that if you're really in some discomfort. Anything can cause this. Colds, you get mucus in those airways. Ear infections can cause it. Any kind of infection causes swelling. Sore throats, nasal congestion, it can make it really hard or almost impossible to equalize that pressure. So later on we're going to talk about the I'm safe checklist. That's one of the things to check for is illness. That's the I, and I'm safe is illness. And so you want to make sure that you and all your passengers are in good shape to get up in that atmosphere where the air is going to expand. Explain that to them. Say, hey, if you have any colds or anything like that, it can expand. It can cause pain. So has anybody had a cold in the last few days? Then kind of use your best judgment from there. Advise against flying with upper respiratory infection or nasal allergenic condition. All right, spatial disorientation. So basically inside the ears, we have these ducts and these kind of little bones and things like that. And inside these tubes is a fluid, and those fluids help us determine our balance. And so when we get spatial disorientation is because that balance, the fluid is in the little hairs and nerves inside those tubes are sending us the incorrect message. So when you are spatially disoriented and you have a loss of orientation, this is a temporary state of confusion where a pilot doesn't know what your attitude or motion is. And you might be thinking to yourself, how could I not know which direction I'm going? Well, maybe you can't see outside. Maybe it's nighttime. Maybe you're dizzy. Maybe you're having some other condition or something like that. And the fluids are telling you incorrect information inside your ears there. And so for pilots who are like, I just fly by feel all the time, it's like, well, that's a good way to get you in trouble. If you can see outside all the time and you're feeling perfectly healthy, yeah, sure, you can fly by feel. But honestly, you need to rely on your instruments more to help prevent spatial disorientation, particularly if you start to lose sight of the horizon due to haze and some other things. This includes night flight, clouds, or in flying through dust. There's these fluid canals right here. And that's what's causing this. So before I go into these, you should know that you have these tubes and there's hairs inside the tubes, and the fluid sort of pushes against those and it lets you know which way you're kind of leaning and whatnot. When we're sitting here on Earth at 1G, that's fine. But when you're turning in an airplane, it's pulling down and away from that. Your body starts to think that that's downward instead of that. And that you get what's called the leans, and that leads to some of these more aggravated things like graveyard spirals and some other things here. So this starts with a very slow entry into a baked turn. It can be to the left or right. And because the turn happens so slowly, the fluid in your ear canals thinks that there's no friction, and you don't feel like you're turning. You feel like you're straight up and down. And you wind up just tightening and tightening and tightening and tightening this spiral. And if you don't catch it in time, you could stress the airplane. You could hit something like a mountain, something like that. It can be fatal. Another one's called false horizon. This has to do with sloping cloud formations. This actually happened to me once. I thought I was flying straight level. I kept looking over. I was like, I thought I was holding 13,500, and I was climbing up to like 14,500. And that's because the clouds were actually like this, not like this. And I was just trying to use that as my horizon, so I was just following them right on up, just perfectly, it's distanced from them like I'm supposed to be. Nah, it was creating spatial disorientation of thinking I was level when I was actually pitched up, and slowing down and climbing and maybe getting hypoxic. It could be a bad situation. But it causes you to pitch the aircraft incorrectly, like I just described. And so you want to ensure that outside visual references are fixed points of the surface. If not, use your attitude indicator, use your altimeter, cross-check your attitude indicator with your altimeter, make sure they're not moving and changing, or if they are changing, they're going in the direction like you feel like you're going. All right, we're going to talk about vision next. We're going to talk about vision. And this is our eye here, and this is the front of the eye on the right side, and the left side is the back of the eye. And a lot of what we're talking about are these rods and cones, and that has to do with night vision and day vision. And the light comes in through this way, and it strikes these cells in the back, these receptors, and they transmit it to the optic nerve and try to, help us see with our eyes. But there's a lot of hazards with vision. Vision is probably the most important sense in the body when it comes to flying, and it can have environmental factors that impacts our ability to see. One is like the runway width. If you have a narrow runway, you typically have a lower than normal approach, and a wide runway, you typically are higher than normal approach. And the reason why is if you see this wide runway, you think you're really low and you're really not. So you fly this high approach, and then you come into land and you're just watching the runway go by. You can go right off the end of the runway or eat up a lot of runway that you don't plan on. And then the narrow, smaller one, that's really more of a dangerous one, particularly at night, because you think, oh, I'm really high, I better get down. Next thing you know, you're almost right on the ground, and you're like, how is this happening? And so, yeah, it definitely plays with your ability to judge things. So you need to fly off your instruments. You need to make sure that you're cross-checking. I think I'm at 500 AGL, and look at your altimeter and see if you're actually what altitude you're at on final. Another one dealing with runways is runway slope. If you have a downsloping runway, it can create the illusion that the aircraft is lower than it actually is, leading to a higher approach. An upsloping runway can create the illusion that the aircraft is higher than it is, leading to a lower approach. Also, if you have a sloping runway, it causes you to flare, and you can, if it's sloping up, you'll run into the runway before you're ready to. And if it's downsloping, you'll flare and just keep flying and flying and flying and flying. So you got to be careful with those sloping runways. You can look up the slope of the runway in the chart supplement. If you have featureless terrain, like you're landing at night, like you are in this picture here, it creates the illusion that the aircraft's actually higher than it is. You feel like you're nice and high, but you better check those PAPIs. In this case, the guys, or the pilot, I should say, is on the glide slope there. And so, yeah, you want to make sure that you always checking that altimeter, especially at night, especially IFR, but always checking that altimeter. Then you have haze. You think you're a greater distance away from things when you are with haze. Haze actually makes things that are really close look like they're a little further away. Let's talk about night vision a little bit. So night vision, to prepare for that, because of the rods and cones, pilots should avoid bright white lights for 30 minutes prior to a night flight to allow your eyes to adapt to the darkness. And due to the eye's physiology, the rods are way more sensitive in low light. Off-center vision is better than direct vision at night. Now, what that means is, number one, you have rods and cones in the eyes, then rods are for night vision. And if you avoid white light for a while, they'll rearrange themselves so that you can see really well at night. They're very sensitive. If you hit them with bright white light, they rearrange them. They put the cones, they swap places with the cones and things like that. But the off-center viewing thing is interesting because you can actually see a little bit better with the edge of the eye than not. So if you're trying to see something, like they say traffic 11 o'clock and 6 miles, instead of staring at 11 o'clock and doing that, you could kind of look at 11 o'clock, move your head about 10 degrees, and sort of scan it with the peripheral of your eye. You'll actually see that motion a lot more. Our peripheral vision is very strong in humans. Concentration of cones creates night blind spot in the center field of vision. Another reason to use off-center vision there. So if you're going to do off-center vision, look 5 degrees to 10 degrees off-center of an object to see it clearly at night. We just talked about that. All right, let's talk about carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, you may have like a carbon monoxide detector in your house or something like that. But basically, our problem is in the plane. And what happens in the plane, especially small planes, is you have these exhaust pipes going, overboard, taking the exhaust from the engine out. But sometimes they take that exhaust pipe and wrap it in like a metal shroud, and they heat that air, and then they pump that hot air into the cabin. That's what we use for heat in small planes. Now the problem is sometimes you can get a crack in that pipe. The shroud's fine, but the pipe inside is slightly cracked and it's leaking carbon monoxide. So now the heat is coming in and it's feeling really nice, but it's also bringing this carbon monoxide gas with us. And carbon monoxide is odorless and tasteless. Now, exhaust is not, but the actual gas that can harm us is completely odorless, tasteless, invisible, all that bad stuff. And so it's really, really hard to detect without knowing the symptoms of it or without a detector of some kind. So let's take a look at carbon monoxide here. Number one, carbon monoxide is a colorless, odorless gas produced by all combustion engines. It enters the flight deck or cabin through the heater into frost vents. We just talked about that. Number two, if you're starting to get carbon monoxide poisoning, you're going to get blurred vision. Your thinking is going to be rough. You're going to feel dizzy, tightness across the forehead. I feel kind of nauseous, I think, when I've been around like exhaust fumes and things like that. You can lose complete muscle power. It can put you to sleep. It really can. Now, if you feel like you're having a problem with carbon monoxide or you've noticed the detector going off, first thing you want to do is turn off the heater, open the air vents. If you have a small plane like a Cessna, you can pop open the windows. You can even open the doors in flight, quite honestly. I don't recommend it, but you can do it. So you get that gas out of there as fast as possible and try to flood the cabin with fresh air. If it can be made worse, this poisoning, by increasing your altitude because of hypoxia. Also, if you are a tobacco smoker or a vapor, you can also get carbon monoxide poisoning. And so that could actually, if you have enough lung damage, you can actually be denied your medical. So that's something to think about if you're a smoker. You can get detectors like this. They're usually about the size of a playing card, and they just stick to the dash, and you replace them every like 18 months or whatever it says on the box there. And then if it turns a certain color, it's detecting carbon monoxide. All right, scuba diving. So lots of people who like scuba diving also like flying. So we got to be careful with that. Or maybe you're flying around the Caribbean as a commercial pilot or something like that, or for fun. But in the AIM, not the FARs, there's no real laws about this. There's just some suggestions, and they talk about decompression sickness after scuba diving in AIM 8-1-2. And what you want to do is you want to make sure that passengers have had enough time to allow excess nitrogen to be worked out of their system. So if you don't know much about scuba diving, when you're under the water, you build up nitrogen when you are breathing through that system. And when you're below, it's called like 1 atmosphere, I believe it is. It's like around 30 meters or something, or 30 feet or something like that. You absorb it more. So divers should do what's called decompression on the way up. They should do stops on the way up to help decompress and get the nitrogen out. So when they get to the surface, they don't get the bends. And so you can still have some that build up in your body, the excess of nitrogen built up in your body, even if you didn't have to do stops on the way up or you did them properly. So as you go up in the atmosphere, what happens is that nitrogen expands, and it can blow up literally in your body. And so how do we kind of assure that we're not going to do any damage to anybody who's been scuba diving? Well, here's what they suggest. They say dives not requiring a controlled descent with stops along the way up to decompress. Pilots should wait at least 12 hours prior to flying up to altitudes up to 8,000 feet MSL. So if you're going to 8,000, not AGL, but MSL, so if you fly up above to 8,000 feet, you should probably wait at least 12 hours before doing that. Now, if you're going up to or above 8,000, you should wait 24 hours. Sorry, I got this backwards. If it required a controlled descent on the way up, so if it required stops on the way up, you should wait 24 hours to go up to 8,000. And then they say anything above 8,000 feet, you should wait at least 24 hours. I know a lot of people who fly around Mexico and the Caribbean and do scuba diving stuff, and they wait 2 days before they fly home. So they have a couple days of diving, then they have a couple days of sightseeing, and then they fly home. That way you're just assured. There's really no real good way to measure it easily that I know of before you go flying. The AIM also says that their actual flight altitudes above sea level, not pressurized cabin altitudes, because The reason why is because if you were in a pressurized, you might be like, hey, I'm in a pressurized plane. I'm not going to go above 8,000. Yeah, but what happens if you have a rapid decompression and that person then perishes in the survival? Rapid decompression is a very survivable event by itself, but somebody could perish or die because they suddenly expand because they didn't wait the appropriate amount of time before they go flying. So we're always kind of thinking worst case scenario, will this person survive this flight here? All right, let's take the I'm safe checklist. This will be the last thing we do. So write this in your notes. But the I'm safe checklist is used by pilots to self-assess their physical and mental fitness before flying. This is one of those pre-flight things we should do before we go flying. Before I even go to the airport to fly, this is something I'll do at home before I drive all the way to the airport. I stop and think for just a minute about, like, is this the right day to fly or not? And IMSAFE stands for different things we should check. Like number one, illness. We talked about sinus and ear issues, right? Vision issues, things like that. Have I had an illness lately where I have a buildup of mucus of some kind, or I've got infections of some kind that could get worse as I go up in the atmosphere? After illness, we have medication. Am I on any medications that would preclude me from flying safely? These could be over-the-counter medications or prescription. Stress, mental. How's my mental health? Am I just super stressed out and just super mad at the argument I had with my family member, or just super worried about my interview tomorrow so I can't focus? Stress just takes our focus away from safe flying. Alcohol. We talked about the rules in 9117 about the different rules around alcohol. No alcohol in the last 8 hours. No effects of alcohol. No blood content over 0.04. And no medications that interfere, as well as we talked about with the M's. Then we have fatigue. How am I feeling? Did I get enough sleep last night? Now, there's chronic fatigue and acute fatigue. There's two different kinds of fatigue. Acute fatigue is just when you haven't had enough rest in the last 24 hours. You just didn't get enough sleep last night. It can still get worse as you go up in the atmosphere. Chronic fatigue, you haven't had good sleep in several days. That can be potentially very dangerous, and you definitely should not fly if you're suffering from fatigue. Excuse yourself from that flight. Then E is eating. How are you nourished enough? Are you starving? When I get too hungry, I get bad headaches. I get cranky. Blood sugar goes down, whatever. Also, some people say E also stands for emotions. So I guess it just depends on your personality. I'm definitely emotional when I haven't eaten. But I would say that, check your emotions. Are you really upset, disturbed, sad? How are your emotions before you get in the plane? You want to be pretty even keel before you get into the airplane. And that's it. That's lessons on aeromedical factors for private pilots.